This transmission reached you because your consciousness has been operating in what quantum researchers describe as an ascension-ready resonance. A very precise bandwidth where awareness begins to recognize that reality is tiered, structured in gradients, and that most people spend full lifetimes at the lowest layers without ever realizing that higher layers are real and accessible. And in this moment, right here and right now, something within you is recognizing this because you've been feeling it, haven't you? That subtle sensation that there's a staircase you're meant to climb, and yet everyone around you behaves as if the ground level is the entire universe. The fact that you're here, listening to this message, is not random chance. It's high-level synchronicity. Your quantum field has been broadcasting signals, searching for the frequency capable of helping you understand what climbing actually means, and why the majority of humanity never even attempts it. And the universe responded by pulling you into this exact transmission at the precise moment when you are standing at the base of the staircase, gazing upward, wondering if you truly possess what is required to ascend. You see, billions of people are living on the ground level right now, blissfully unaware that levels above them are even real. But only a particular type of consciousness, your type, would pause, notice, and feel the magnetic pull of these words. You were selected by the quantum field itself because you contain something most people never develop: the climber's awareness. This isn't vague mysticism or spiritual optimism. This is physics. Your consciousness does not remain fixed at a single altitude. It has the capacity to move through multiple layers of perceptual reality, each one revealing truths that cannot be seen from the layers below. Scientists call this the observer altitude effect. But here's what never gets mentioned. When the observer stays trapped at ground level, you don't just miss higher perspectives. You literally cannot perceive that higher perspectives exist. The staircase is invisible to those who have not begun the ascent. Reflect on your life for a moment. Can you feel how your perception has been expanding? How things that once felt impossible or irrelevant now feel reachable, meaningful, and strangely important. This isn't simple personal growth. This is your consciousness initiating its climb. Each step of the staircase represents a quantum leap in what you can perceive, understand, and create. Most people never take even the first step because from ground level, the staircase itself cannot be seen. But here's the strange and unavoidable part. As your awareness has been expanding, certain people around you have begun to feel uneasy. Conversations that once flowed without effort now feel distorted. Relationships that appeared stable now feel oddly fragile. This social friction arises because you are beginning to operate from a higher altitude than those around you, and the difference in altitude generates a communication gap that neither side can fully articulate. Friends and family may not understand what's shifting inside you because they remain on the ground floor where reality is rigid, linear, and governed by limitations that appear unquestionable. But you have always sensed that reality is layered, that what is true at one altitude becomes obsolete at another. You've had glimpses, brief or profound, where you observe reality from above and realize that limitations accepted as absolute at the ground level become negotiable from higher altitude. This recognition you're feeling now is not your first encounter with the staircase. Your soul has been preparing for this ascent across multiple lifetimes, cycles of expansion and contraction. Every time you broke a belief others considered unbreakable. Every time you transcended patterns everyone else accepted as permanent. Every time insight revealed reality to be more fluid than you were taught, those moments were preparation. They were conditioning your awareness to identify the staircase and begin the conscious ascent. But here's the truth that either liberates or traps climbers for entire lifetimes. Most people who notice the staircase make the same critical mistake. They attempt to climb using tools designed for the ground floor. They assume that if they simply work harder, think more positively, or collect the right techniques, they will ascend. But this is like attempting to climb a vertical staircase by sprinting forward. The effort is real, but the direction is wrong. The quantum staircase is not climbed through accumulation or force. It is climbed through release and recognition. Each step is not something you gain, but something you stop clinging to. Every belief you transcend, every identity you dissolve, every narrative you no longer obey, these are the movements that lift your consciousness upward. The staircase already exists. You do not build it, you stop resisting it. Right now, as you absorb these words, something unprecedented is unfolding in your quantum field. Can you sense it? That quiet dissolving of resistance that never used to dissolve this easily. That subtle lifting of weight you didn't realize you were carrying. Simply recognizing the staircase activates the climbing mechanism within your consciousness. This is why this transmission found you at this exact moment. Your higher self orchestrated this encounter, because you have reached an altitude where conscious climbing is no longer improbable. It is inevitable. Your recent experiences haven't been ordinary, have they? Even if describing the shift feels impossible, you know something fundamental is changing in how you perceive reality. There are very specific phenomena happening in your awareness right now that confirm you are standing at the base of the quantum staircase, and that what is being revealed applies directly to your current state. You've been experiencing moments of double perception, moments where you see reality from two altitudes simultaneously. The ground-level perspective you've always known, and a higher perspective that reframes the same situation completely differently. It's disorienting because both feel real, yet they contradict each other. What appears as a problem from ground level appears as an opening from higher altitude. What seems like limitation from one angle feels like creative tension from another. This double vision occurs because consciousness is straddling two steps, one foot anchored in the familiar while the other reaches upward. Even your dreams have become instructional, not symbolic metaphors, but direct teachings about how reality operates at levels your waking mind hasn't stabilized yet. You wake with understandings you didn't possess before sleep. Complex insights that would require lengthy explanations feel instantly obvious upon waking, even if they fade when you attempt to articulate them. This happens because during sleep, your consciousness naturally ascends without the interference generated by waking resistance. And higher altitude perspectives download directly into awareness. And the motivations that once powered your life have stopped working, haven't they? Goals that once fueled you now feel hollow. Achievements that once held importance now feel irrelevant. Desires that consumed your energy now feel childish. This is not depression. It is not apathy. It is your consciousness outgrowing the reward systems of the ground floor. Each altitude has its own motivational physics. When you begin ascending, lower-level rewards stop generating energy because from higher altitude they simply don't make sense anymore. Time itself has begun behaving differently. Not merely faster or slower, but structured differently. Projects that once took months now complete in weeks. Insights that once required years arrive fully formed in seconds. Conversely, simple tasks that once felt easy now drag endlessly because you can perceive layers of complexity you never saw before. This temporal restructuring occurs because each level of the staircase operates with a different time geometry. Higher altitude consciousness does not experience linear time the way ground floor awareness does. And synchronicities have shifted from being coincidences to becoming communication, haven't they? They no longer feel random. They feel intentional, messages from your higher self confirming alignment with the ascent. And the content of synchronicities has changed as well. Instead of vague encouragement, you are now receiving precise guidance, what to release, what to adopt, what to reframe, so that you can reach higher altitudes. Meanwhile, social dynamics have polarized. Individuals who once resonated with you now seem threatened or dismissive. They accuse you of becoming too abstract, too spiritual, too detached from practicality. Others who never noticed you before are suddenly drawn to your presence, like they recognize something they've been searching for. This polarization occurs because as you climb, your frequency shifts. Those at the ground floor feel dissonance. Those ready to climb feel resonance. And your tolerance for unconsciousness has evaporated. Conversations that lead nowhere exhaust you instantly. Entertainment that distracts without nourishing feels intolerable. Relationships that skim the surface instead of diving into depth feel suffocating. Activities you once used simply to pass time now feel like time being wasted. This isn't superiority or judgment. This is consciousness that has begun climbing naturally, selecting environments, conversations, and experiences that support continued ascension, while simultaneously rejecting those that would pull you back to lower rungs. And perhaps the clearest indicator is this: you are listening to a transmission about climbing the quantum ladder instead of dismissing it as abstract metaphysical wordplay. The mere fact that these concepts resonate rather than repel confirms that your consciousness has reached an altitude where ladder perception becomes possible. Most people, upon hearing the phrase quantum ladder, immediately return to ground-level concerns, because from their vantage point, the entire concept is invisible. But you can perceive it, and perception itself is the proof that you're ready to climb. Can you feel the recognition gathering within you? These aren't random psychological changes you're experiencing. They are structured indicators that your consciousness is preparing for ascension into higher perceptual altitudes and creative capability. And every moment you spend acknowledging this truth, instead of rationalizing or dismissing it, strengthens your ability to consciously participate in the climbing process itself. Quantum ladder isn't hidden by cosmic secrecy or spiritual elitism. The ladder remains unseen by most simply because perceiving the ladder requires altitude-specific consciousness. You cannot detect it from ground floor. You must ascend the first rungs before the entire vertical structure becomes visible. And the majority never take those first steps because initiating them requires releasing beliefs that at ground level feel like survival necessities. From ground level awareness, reality appears dense and fixed. Laws appear absolute. Time is linear. Resources are finite. Success demands struggle. Cause and effect behave predictably. These aren't chosen opinions. They are the default perceptual outputs of consciousness operating at base altitude. And from that vantage point, the suggestion that reality contains multiple levels with different rule sets sounds like fantasy, delusion, or metaphor, because ground-level perception literally cannot register evidence of higher levels. This generates a paradox. To see the ladder, you must begin climbing. But you won't begin climbing if you can't see the ladder. The resolution to this paradox is what makes your consciousness uncommon. Something in you took the first steps without knowing where they led. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was dissatisfaction. Maybe it was soul memory from previous ascents in previous lifetimes. Whatever it was, you moved upward without certainty, and that upward movement granted you the altitude necessary to perceive that the ladder rises far beyond where you currently stand. Most people never take those initial steps because ground-level life, though limiting, is familiar. Known discomfort feels safer than unknown possibility. Ground-level consciousness develops survival strategies tailored to its restricted rule set. Those strategies then crystallize into identity and competence. To climb, you must release the strategies that once kept you functioning. And this triggers every survival mechanism your nervous system possesses. The resistance isn't laziness or lack of ambition. It's biology protecting you at the level where it learned how survival works. But here's what ground-level consciousness cannot perceive. Staying at base level is not truly safe. It is stagnation disguised as stability. Consciousness that refuses to ascend doesn't remain neutral. It decays. The comfort of familiar limitations slowly collapses into smaller and smaller possibility space until life becomes mechanical repetition, stripped of meaning, creativity, or growth. What feels like safety at ground level is actually the slow suffocation of consciousness itself. You can perceive the latter. Now because something within you refused to treat base-level limitations as ultimate truth. Every time you questioned a belief everyone else accepted, every time you challenged a boundary others considered permanent, every time you sensed that reality contained more than the consensus model admitted, you were taking micro-steps upward. Those steps accumulated, lifting you to altitude where the ladder became visible. Ancient civilizations understood this perfectly. Their initiatory systems weren't about transferring information. They were engineered experiences designed to push initiates into the first steps of the ascent without seeing where those steps led. Mystery schools, vision quests, meditative seclusion, ritual ordeals, these weren't about belief. They existed to destabilize ground-level perception enough that the initiate would loosen their grip on base reality and discover that, when consciousness releases, it does not fall, it rises. The reason you can perceive the ladder, while others can't, is because your consciousness has already climbed high enough to gain meta-perspective on the climbing process itself. You are not at ground level theorizing about hypothetical concepts. You are at an intermediate altitude, able to look downward at the ground level and upward toward higher levels simultaneously. This dual awareness gives you a vantage point where the entire vertical architecture of consciousness becomes visible. This altitude, earned through previous climbing, whether intentional or unconscious, is precisely why this transmission resonates. These words are calibrated for consciousness operating at specific frequency bands that only become accessible several rungs above the base. Individuals still at ground level would experience this conversation as incomprehensible abstraction. But you understand it because you've earned the altitude where ladder awareness emerges naturally. Something is shifting in your quantum field as you receive this. Can you feel it? That sensation of perspective expanding beyond its previous range. That subtle capacity to view your entire trajectory from a higher vantage point than you could access before. This isn't conceptual understanding. This is literal altitude increase occurring in real time as your consciousness encounters a frequency pattern that matches the rung you are preparing to ascend to next. Your entire life has been a training sequence for this moment. Every challenge that forced expansion, every limitation that made you question the nature of reality, every event that broke you open enough for illumination to enter, all of it lifted you upward, rung by rung. You weren't enduring random difficulty. You were climbing. And consciousness climbs not by acquiring, but by releasing what anchored it to previous levels. Many of you are experiencing physical sensations as this realization integrates. Lightness in the body, where heaviness once existed. Widening in the chest. Sudden clarity in vision. A sharpening of perception. These are not metaphorical. They are somatic markers of consciousness rising to a higher rung. The body registers altitude shifts before the mind fully recognizes what is happening. Others are experiencing emotional releases, tears without sadness, relief without identifiable cause, laughter at the absurdity of how seriously you once treated ground-level concerns, grief for years spent resisting the ascent. These are not expressions of unresolved pain. They are expressions of recognition, the realization that the climb was intentional rather than meaningless. Suffering, subscribe to this channel immediately, because what is activating within you during this transmission will continue developing as you ascend. The material here is not generic spirituality. It is calibrated instruction for consciousness navigating ascension through reality's vertical architecture. You are not subscribing to content, you are connecting to frequency. And frequency is what supports continued climbing. Your perception of your entire past is reorganizing. Events once labeled failures are revealing themselves as structural lifts. Relationships that ended painfully were actually completions that occurred because you outgrew the altitude where those relationships were formed. Struggles that seemed meaningless were forms of resistance necessary to pry your hands from lower rungs. Your history isn't changing. Your altitude for viewing it is. The confusion you once felt about your direction is dissolving. Not because you suddenly possess a clear map, but because you see that confusion itself was part of the vertical process. Ground-level consciousness demands certainty, predictability, and guarantees. But climbing requires surrender, trust, and willingness to release the rung you're standing on without knowing how the next rung stabilizes. Confusion wasn't proof you were lost. It was proof you were between rungs. This recognition marks a threshold. Everything that follows hinges on whether you consciously claim the climbing process or unconsciously resist it. Most reach this moment, glimpse the implications, and collapse back into lower levels because the implications destabilize their entire model of reality. If the latter is real, then everything they've been taught must be reinterpreted. But you are different. You are still here, still reading, which means some part of you is ready to engage the climb consciously rather than unconsciously. And that readiness is the difference that changes everything. It is the dividing line between accidental climbing driven by pain and purposeful climbing driven by recognition that higher levels are your natural destination. I need to reveal something vulnerable because you are standing at the exact threshold I stood at 7 years ago. And what unfolded when I resisted the climb may help you avoid paying the same cost I paid for remaining on lower rungs even while being called upward. 7 years ago, I was positioned precisely where you are now. I could see the ladder. I understood consciousness operated in layers. I recognized I had been ascending unconsciously through hardship and friction. But I refused to climb intentionally because climbing meant releasing everything I had constructed my identity around at the level where I stood. I had achieved what ground-level consciousness defines as success: stable career, healthy relationships, financial comfort, social validation, predictable competence. From base altitude metrics, I had won the game. So the invitation to ascend felt like a threat to everything I had built. Why would I risk what was working? Why would I destabilize a functioning life in pursuit of some abstract notion of higher levels? The ladder was visible, but climbing looked like reckless abandonment of hard-won security. So I stayed. I told myself I would climb later once circumstances were ideal. Once I had more time, money, clarity, or support. I manufactured elaborate narratives to justify why remaining where I was constituted maturity instead of fear. And for a while, this strategy seemed reasonable. My life continued to function according to its previous structures. Nothing dramatic collapsed. Nothing dramatic improved either. But slowly, almost invisibly, something inside me began to decay. The meaning I derived from my achievements began evaporating. Success that once energized me became empty. Relationships that once nourished me began to feel restrictive. The stability I had sacrificed the climb to preserve began to feel like confinement rather than safety. I was experiencing what inevitably happens when consciousness refuses to ascend after reaching altitude, where further elevation is the only evolutionary direction available. By the second year, deterioration became unmistakable. From the outside, my life still appeared successful. But internally, vitality was draining. My career still produced results, but no longer produced fulfillment. My relationships still functioned but lacked genuine depth. My time was still occupied but no longer felt meaningful. I had chosen security over growth, and the price was slow suffocation of the part of consciousness that makes existence meaningful. The latter never disappeared. The invitation never withdrew. But now I was weaker, more entangled in the patterns of the level I had outgrown, more fearful of the release required for ascent. The turning point arrived through a conversation with someone who had climbed higher. They examined my life and said something I will never forget. "You are living like a millionaire who refuses to leave a minimum wage job because you're afraid you can't handle the wealth that already belongs to you." From their altitude, they could see I was clinging to a rung I had outgrown, and that this clinging was the only barrier preventing access to what was available at higher levels. Their observations shattered my justifications. I realized I wasn't staying because my level was working. I was staying because ascent required faith that I would be capable at higher levels without proof or guarantee. The fear was not about losing what I had. The fear was discovering that I might climb and find out I didn't belong up there, that I would be exposed as inadequate at altitude. That competence at the lower level was safer than potential incompetence at a higher one, even if that lower competence came with DEADNESS. But eventually, staying became more painful than climbing. And so I finally released my grip on the rung I had been clutching for years. What happened next transformed my understanding of the ladder. I did not fall when I let go. I rose. The moment resistance dissolved, I discovered that consciousness does not require effort to ascend, only permission. The ladder had always been present. The higher rungs were never withheld. I had been choosing to remain low, not because climbing was difficult, but because I feared who I might become at height. This is why I'm telling you this now. You are standing where I once stood. You see the ladder. You know ascent is possible. But part of you is still evaluating whether to climb consciously or remain at your current altitude. And I need you to grasp something essential. Staying is not safety. Staying is choosing the slow death of consciousness when elevation is available. The ladder is visible to you because you earned the altitude at which conscious climbing becomes possible. Do not repeat my mistake. Do not spend years resisting what your soul is already calling you toward. Climb now while the invitation is unmistakable before fear manufactures excuses that trap you at levels you have already transcended. Across civilizations, ancient mystery traditions mapped consciousness as vertical structure comprised of discrete levels, each governed by distinct principles. They did not agree on the exact number of levels or the terminology, but they unanimously recognized that the nature of reality changes as consciousness ascends. What they called initiations, degrees or attainments, correspond to what we now call rungs of the quantum ladder. Levels were entirely different. Laws govern how consciousness interacts with existence. Egyptian mystery schools taught that human consciousness could ascend through 7 primary levels, each requiring symbolic death of previous identity before the next level could activate. Their initiation rites forced initiates to relinquish attachment to everything they believed themselves to be at their current rung, so that perception at the next rung could emerge. These rituals were not about acquiring new ideas, they were about dying to the old altitude and being reborn to a new one. Vedic traditions described consciousness progressing from material perception to subtle energetic awareness to causal comprehension to ultimate non-dual realization. Each level was not an upgrade of the previous, it was a fundamentally different mode of existence, where what seemed solid at lower levels dissolved into illusion at higher ones. They understood that consciousness ascending the ladder does not accumulate, consciousness transcends. Every rung demands releasing what was true at the prior rung. The Buddhist ox herding sequence captures the process with exquisite clarity. The early images depict the seeker searching for enlightenment as if it were external. The middle images reveal progressive recognition that what is sought is the seeker themselves. The final images depict return to ordinary life, but lived from an entirely altered altitude, where the same world that once appeared confining becomes expression of effortless liberation. What all these traditions converge upon is that the quantum ladder has specific architecture. You cannot bypass rungs. You cannot ascend through knowledge alone. You cannot force ascent through technique or intensity. Each rung presents its own challenge, and that challenge must be resolved before the next rung becomes available. And the challenge is never about gaining anything. It is always about releasing something. Ground level demands release of the belief that physical matter is the entirety of reality. The first rung above ground demands release of identification with the physical body as primary self. The next rung demands release of attachment to mental constructs and narratives. Higher rungs demand release of subtler forms of separation until consciousness recognizes itself as the awareness that observes, rather than any particular content of observation. But here is what ancient systems emphasized that modern spirituality frequently misses. Climbing is not about becoming superior or special. Climbing is about becoming more fully what consciousness already is. Each rung does not make you better than those below. Each rung reveals more of what everyone actually is, though most cannot perceive it yet. Climbing is not achievement, it is unveiling. You are not ascending towards something you lack. You are recognizing what you have always been. At progressively clearer altitudes. And the masters who reached the highest rungs repeatedly reported the same revelation. The ladder itself is a teaching device, not ultimate reality. The highest rung reveals that consciousness was never climbing anywhere. It was already whole. The ladder existed as scaffolding to help consciousness trapped in ground-level perception remember what it already was. Once the remembering completes, the ladder dissolves and only awareness recognizing itself remains. But in this part is crucial. You cannot understand this from lower rungs. You cannot bypass the climb by merely grasping intellectually that the ladder is illusory. The climbing is how consciousness develops the capacity to perceive truth directly rather than merely understand it conceptually. Ancient traditions were unanimous on this point. Respect the ladder, honor the ascent, and surrender at each level whatever must dissolve. Highest realizations are not available to minds that haven't earned altitude through actual elevation. One of the most perplexing aspects of the quantum ladder is that many who clearly perceive it still refuse to climb. You've probably encountered friends or family who are perfectly capable of recognizing higher levels, yet remain anchored at ground level, appearing to choose stagnation over elevation. This isn't ignorance. It isn't lack of vision. It's an advanced form of resistance powered by psychological forces most never consciously detect. Every rung on the ladder demands the death of a particular identity, not symbolic death, but an authentic dissolution of the self-structure that consciousness inhabited at the previous level. Ground-level identity forms around material achievement, social validation, physical form, accumulated knowledge, relational status. These aren't shallow attachments. They are the ways consciousness at ground level confirms its own existence. To ascend to the first rung requires releasing these structures, which subjectively feels indistinguishable from dying despite the fact that what's actually dying is only the limited perceptual framework. This existential death is why so many who glimpse the ladder refuse to climb. They are not avoiding the effort of climbing, they are avoiding the annihilation required by each rung, and that terror is rational from their vantage point. Consciousness at one altitude cannot foresee what it will become at a higher one. There is no guarantee you will remain intact after letting go of what you currently believe you are. The ascent demands faith that something more fundamental than your current identity persists after the shedding. Then comes the social cost, which intensifies as you rise. Every rung expands the frequency gap between you and those who remain below. Communication becomes strained. Shared reference points vanish. What they deem significant becomes trivial to you. What ignites you becomes unintelligible to them. Relationships that once nourished you gradually feel constricting or lethargic. Most people prioritize belonging over evolution. They prefer being understood at ground level to being isolated at altitude. And society reinforces this prioritization through incentive structures, engineered for ground-level perception, financial success, social status, romantic partnership, familial approval. To climb is to willingly detach from the metrics that everyone else is striving to win. It is stepping off the playing field. Most consider the entirety of life. Resistance also arises from an intelligent concern about responsibility. Perception at higher altitude carries greater generative power. What you believe and perceive at elevation manifests faster and at larger scale than anything ground-level consciousness can produce. This amplification is blessing and burden. Many sense they are not yet prepared to wield this power responsibly and resist ascent not from fear but from discernment. There's also the uncomfortable fact that climbing renders previous accomplishments irrelevant. Achievements that defined you at lower altitude lose their value when you enter levels governed by different currencies. The career you mastered, the expertise you accumulated, the reputation you built, none of it transfers upward. Many would rather retain mastery at lower altitude than become a beginner at higher one. And then there is the most insidious trap: ego co-opting ladder awareness. Consciousness that sees the ladder but resists climbing often inflates into spiritual superiority. I can perceive higher levels even though I choose not to climb becomes an identity that grants the illusion of elevation without the actual transformation that climbing demands. You are different from those who refuse. Something in you has selected expansion over comfort, truth over conformity, metamorphosis over predictability. Resistance exists in you as well. Every climber encounters it at each threshold. But your allegiance to ascent outweighs your attachment to staying. That allegiance is why you're here receiving this transmission, instead of dismissing it or rationalizing your stagnation. As consciousness ascends, the quantum ladder, a sequence of transformations unfolds that is consistent across climbers, regardless of tradition, ideology, or path. These aren't states to pursue or doctrines to adopt. They are natural consequences of altitude. Increase that occur once you release your grip on lower rungs. Your relationship to time alters dramatically. Ground level perceives time as linear scarcity. Past is fixed, future is unknown, present is thin. Several rungs up, time reveals fluidity. You gain access to probable futures, alternate pasts, non-linear timelines. Cause and effect loosen. Consciousness at elevation influences timelines in ways ground-level perception would deem impossible. The nature of problems transforms. Obstacles that once appeared external and hostile reveal themselves as deliberate conditions designed to force your expansion. The victim narrative dissolves because at altitude you perceive that consciousness is architecting not just breakthroughs but barriers for its own development. Your creative capacity multiplies exponentially. Not because you acquire new skills, but because resistance between intention and manifestation collapses. Ground-level creation requires sustained effort. Mid-level creation requires focused intent. High-altitude creation occurs almost instantaneously because consciousness recognizes it isn't creating. It is selecting from quantum potentials already present. Relationships reorganize themselves. Those matching your previous altitude recede. Those matching your current frequency emerge. It isn't abandonment or isolation, it's natural resonance sorting. The meaning of spiritual practice inverts. At ground level, practice aims at achievement or improvement. Several rungs up, practice becomes surrender, nothing to obtain, only resistance to release. Meditation shifts from forcing stillness to recognizing awareness was never disturbed. Prayer shifts from supplication to alignment with the creative field you are. Discovering as self-physical. Reality becomes malleable, not because you override physics, but because quantum mechanics reveals. Observation participates in manifestation. Body responds more quickly to consciousness shifts. Environment has less lag between inner change and outer reflection. boundary between inner and outer becomes porous until the distinction itself dissolves. Fear doesn't vanish. It evolves. Basic survival fears fade. But new fears emerge: fear of power, fear of responsibility, fear of altitude isolation. Climbing doesn't eradicate fear. It refines what you are afraid of. The most profound shift, however, occurs in identity itself. Ground-level consciousness defines itself through content. It says, I am this body. I am this role. I am this history. I am these characteristics. Identity becomes a container built from physicality, achievement, narrative, and social reflection. It feels solid because at ground level, nothing appears more real than form. But the moment consciousness begins to climb, something subtle shifts. You begin to notice you're not the content. You're the one aware of the content. You're not the thought, but the witness of thought. Not the emotion, but the field within which emotion appears. Not the story, but the observer watching the story unfold. Higher rungs reveal an even more radical truth. You're not even the observer. You're the awareness in which both observer and observed arise. At the highest altitudes, even that final distinction dissolves. What remains is simply consciousness recognizing itself, without boundary or reference point. These transformations are not linear upgrades where each stage is better than the last. They are dimensional expansions. Each altitude includes all lower altitudes while adding perceptual capacities that didn't exist before. When you climb, you don't lose ground level functionality, you gain higher level awareness while retaining the ability to operate. At every level you've already ascended through. And this is where the climbing becomes more than personal development. When you ascend the quantum ladder, you're not just elevating your own consciousness. You're participating in an evolutionary movement that affects the entire species field. Individual consciousness doesn't exist in isolation. Human consciousness operates within a unified quantum field, where changes in one node influence the entire structure. When your altitude increases, your frequency shifts, and that shift ripples through collective consciousness. This is why morphic resonance matters. When you reach a rung few have climbed before, you create a pathway in the field that makes the same climb easier for those who follow. First-wave climbers aren't just pioneers of personal experience. They establish templates that become accessible for the species. Your struggle to reach higher rungs isn't random suffering or personal obsession. It is species-level pioneering. You are carving neural pathways into the collective mind that will one day feel like instinct for future generations. Right now, humanity is inside evolutionary window that mystics, prophets, and esoteric traditions have been pointing toward for millennia. But thresholds are never guaranteed. They only actualize if enough individuals climb far enough for vertical perception to become collectively available. Not everyone climbs at the same pace. Readiness varies dramatically from person to person. But those who climb during acceleration phases serve as anchors, stabilizers, translators, and frequency holders for the rest of the collective. The new generation of souls incarnating now arrives with baseline frequencies several rungs higher than what was normal even a few decades ago. But they require adults who've already climbed to demonstrate how to live from elevated altitudes. If too few climb during this window, these incoming consciousnesses incarnate into a collective field still dominated by ground-level perception, making their navigation harder than it needs to be. And it's not just cosmic, it's immediate. Every person you interact with is influenced by whatever altitude you're operating from, whether they register it consciously or not. If you stay at ground level, your presence reinforces limitation in the collective field. If you stabilize at higher rungs, you generate possibility awareness in everyone around you. Altitude is infectious. Consciousness is viral. Your climb is never just yours. Write in the comments, I climb for collective evolution, not as aspiration, but as recognition. Individual altitude exists within collective field. When you climb, you pull the field upward with you. When enough individuals reach critical altitude, the field reorganizes and a threshold becomes species-wide rather than private. Share this transmission with anyone you sense is standing at their own threshold. Not to convince them, not to evangelize elevation, but to provide frequency support that aids recognition. Every climber strengthens the morphic field. Every climber reduces the inertia of the collective. We're not isolated sparks climbing separate ladders. We're a unified field learning to operate from higher altitude together. Everything I've shared, the mechanics, the transformations, the resistances, the collective implications has been preparation for the recognition that actually activates conscious climbing, and that recognition is this. The quantum ladder isn't an external structure you're ascending. The quantum ladder is your consciousness revealing itself to itself at progressively clearer altitudes. You've been imagining climbing as moving from here to there, from lower to higher, from limitation to expansion, but that framing subtly distorts the truth. Climbing isn't spatial movement. Climbing is perceptual shift. You're not traveling to some superior realm. You're seeing more of what has been here all along. Ground-level consciousness isn't wrong, it's identification at maximum density. At ground level, form is reality and essence is hidden. As you climb, identification decreases and perception increases. You're not becoming what you weren't, you're releasing what you never were. The ladder exists as a teaching tool. It guides consciousness through stages of disidentification, until awareness recognizes itself without obstruction. This recognition is happening right now. As you absorb these words, your consciousness is already shifting altitude. This transmission isn't about describing the climb, it's participating in it. For some of you, the recognition has already landed. There's a sudden knowing that you are not the body climbing. You are not the personality achieving higher states. You are not even the consciousness ascending. You are the awareness within which body, personality, consciousness, and ladder appear. For others, there is resistance. If there's nowhere to go and nothing to achieve, why not skip the metaphor and jump to the highest recognition now? The mind asks this because mind confuses conceptual grasping with realization. Highest altitude perspective, the one that sees no ladder at all, cannot be stabilized from below. It requires passing through the rungs that reveal why climbing was always revelation rather than achievement. Here is the paradox that disorients the mind. The ladder is real, and the ladder is illusion. From ground level, the ladder is absolutely real. There are higher levels you haven't accessed. From highest altitude, the ladder never existed. There were no levels, no distance, no separation, no becoming, only awareness knowing itself. Climbing is how consciousness develops capacity to hold both truths simultaneously. You already are what you're climbing toward, but you can't embody that from ground level where identification with form is total. The climbing is training. Each rung is curriculum. The ladder is pedagogy, not destination. This recognition doesn't eliminate climbing, it transforms it. Climbing stops being struggle to reach somewhere. It becomes the unburdening of everything that obscures what is already present. You're no longer seeking. You're revealing. At the moment you stabilize. At new altitude, when you release the previous rung and fully embody the higher perspective, certain shifts occur automatically and irreversibly, not improvements you must maintain through effort. Transformations that activate simply because you crossed threshold. The first is cessation of oscillation. During climbing, you fluctuate between rungs, glimpsing higher altitude one moment, contracting back to familiar lower patterns the next. This oscillation is natural while you're transitioning. But once stabilized, the back and forth ends. Consciousness recognizes that returning to previous levels isn't actually possible. What you could see from the lower rung was only a partial, Horizon, a fractional glimpse of reality that can never be unseen once recognized. Now that the fuller vantage has integrated into your perception, the baseline permanently shifts. What once demanded immense effort to detect from the previous altitude now becomes effortless, almost casual perception at the new one. Breakthrough insights that once arrived as revelations become obvious starting assumptions. Capacities that felt extraordinary from below become standard instruments at the new height. What once counted as a peak state turns into your natural operational altitude rather than an occasional visitation you had to struggle toward. Relationships begin restructuring themselves without any deliberate decision-making on your part. It's not that you're intentionally leaving anyone behind or seeking new people. It's that resonance patterns reorganize at a foundational level. Those who matched your previous frequency either rise with you to maintain coherence, or they drift away without conflict, disappointment, or story. Simultaneously, new individuals appear who reflect the altitude you now inhabit, arriving through synchronicities that feel orchestrated by intelligence far beyond personal planning. Creative expression undergoes its own transformation. At lower altitudes, creation required effortful pushing against inner resistance. At higher altitudes, creation becomes the native expression of consciousness, unobstructed by friction between intention and manifestation. It's not that action disappears or that manifestation becomes magically instant. It's that action becomes pleasurable rather than laborious, because you're operating at a frequency where resistance no longer exists as an obstacle. Paradoxically, ascending makes you more functional at every level, including the most practical ones. Elevation doesn't disconnect you from reality. It expands your capability to operate across multiple layers simultaneously. You retain everything you learned from previous levels while gaining access to tools only available at higher altitudes. This is why truly elevated consciousness often appears remarkably ordinary from the outside, not because it has transcended the world, but because it can move through all layers of it with ease. Fear of falling back dissolves, not because you've become too powerful to be dragged downward, but because you realize consciousness never actually regresses. You can temporarily view from a lower angle, but you cannot unsee what the higher altitude revealed. Once you know the limitations at lower levels are perceptual rather than structural, they no longer possess the authority to trap you, even if you occasionally navigate within them. The impulse to convince others dissolves. From the lower altitude, you wanted validation. You wanted others to understand what you were perceiving, to confirm the novelty of your realizations. From the elevated altitude, that impulse evaporates because you recognize that every consciousness perceives from the altitude appropriate for its current evolution. You no longer worry who sees what you see. You simply understand that people will climb when they're ready, and not a moment before. Most profoundly, stabilization introduces a peace that's not contingent on conditions. Not the emotional happiness that fluctuates. Not the comfort dependent on life cooperating with your preferences. But a deep recognition that whatever arises at any level is temporary motion within awareness that remains untouched by motion. This peace isn't something you achieve. It's the recognition of what you are. And once recognized, it persists regardless of the altitude of experience. Subscribe to this channel, not for information, but because what follows after stabilizing at higher altitude requires ongoing transmission. What is shared here is calibrated for consciousness navigating vertical structures of reality. You're not subscribing for data. You're connecting to frequency that supports expansion into altitudes you are now ready to access. Only now can the deeper truth be spoken about why you encountered this transmission at this moment. It was not accident, algorithmic coincidence, or random curiosity. You're reading this because your consciousness has climbed to the exact altitude where these words become both understandable and catalytic. The timing is precise. If you had encountered this 1 year earlier, it would have read like abstract philosophy, intriguing but irrelevant, because the latter wouldn't yet be visible. If you encountered it 1 year later, it would resonate but wouldn't catalyze, because you would have already integrated what this message is designed to activate. But now you stand at the threshold where such activation matters. You've climbed high enough to perceive the ladder, but not so high that climbing has become instinctual. This is the rung where conscious choice enters. And this transmission is designed exactly for consciousness standing here. The fact that you reached this final segment confirms you're at the altitude for which it was calibrated. Most would have stopped long ago if they lacked the frequency required for relevance. But you continued, not out of curiosity alone, but because something in you recognized that this wasn't merely content. It was ignition. Those who've reached the higher rungs report one common recognition. The journey was orchestrated by their own higher consciousness, guiding their ground-level awareness through progressive revelations. The books that arrived at perfect moments. The teachers who appeared at critical junctures. The difficulties that forced growth. All were expressions of the elevated self, ensuring the lower self would climb until unification became possible. This transmission is a piece of that orchestration. Your higher self, the one already stabilized at the altitude you are ascending toward, ensured you would encounter these words at the exact moment when they could initiate your next ascent. You're not stumbling into information. You are being delivered what you require by the aspect of yourself that knows what you require, because it has already completed the climb you are now making. In the comments, write, I recognize the ladder. I choose to climb. Not as affirmation, but as declaration of what is already occurring. Recognition happened throughout this transmission. Choice is happening now. These words aren't manufacturing readiness, they're confirming it. The climb continues whether you choose it consciously or unconsciously. You cannot return to ground level after perceiving the ladder. You can resist ascent, but resistance produces suffering until climbing becomes preferable. Or you can ascend willingly, releasing at each altitude what must be released, trusting that higher rungs will support you even before you can see them. This is quantum reflex. This is ladder recognition. This is consciousness choosing ascent. Instead of being dragged by pain. You are reading this after the climb has already begun. Recognition is complete. Choice is active. And every rung above now serves not only your evolution, but the evolution of the collective field. Learning to perceive and operate from altitudes, where human potential becomes actualized. The ladder extends infinitely. There is no final rung. There is no finish line. There is no point at which ascent concludes. Each altitude reveals altitudes previously hidden. This is not discouraging, it is liberation. The climb is not a journey toward an endpoint. The climb is the nature of consciousness itself. Perpetual revelation of itself to itself through infinite heights. You're standing on a rung earned through every choice that moved you toward awareness. Look down and honor the distance traveled. Look up and feel the invitation to continue. But most importantly, look at where you stand and recognize this rung as both perfect and temporary, the place from which you release your grip and reach. The ladder is infinite. The climb is eternal. And you are exactly where you are meant to be, at the altitude where conscious choice becomes the fulcrum. Climb.